Welcome to Your College Bound Kid,
a podcast for parents, college counselors, students, and anyone who wants a weekly deep dive into the world of college admissions.
Hi, I'm Susan, and I'm a college counselor and have read applications for a small liberal arts college and 2 research universities. My twins are recent college graduates.
I'm Lisa, and I'm a clinical psychologist and college counselor. I have a daughter in college, a daughter in high school, and a son in middle school. After 30 years in Chicago, we recently moved to North Carolina.
My name is Mark. I'm a college coach in Atlanta and the parent of 2 daughters. Karis, a graduate of Davidson College, and she is the founder of the Spanish tutoring company, SpanishHelpToday.com. And Joy has a bachelor's degree from the University of Georgia and a master's degree from North Carolina State University. She works in private practice in Raleigh as a mental health therapist. And I'm so blessed to be able to work alongside both my beautiful daughters at School Match for You, a college counseling firm that I founded in 2010. Good morning, friends. This is a very special week for me this week and next week. This week is episode 400. And next week is our anniversary, the start of year 7. Now, I know a few weeks ago I said, wow, episode 400 and our anniversary coincide in the same week. But Lisa, you can laugh at me. That was like bad math. So we started the first week of February. So that'll be next week, the start of year 7. Today is episode 400. And I think the word that comes to my mind is just exhilaration. You know, when we first started this podcast back in September of 2017, it was just Anika and me, the 2 of us together. We didn't know what we were doing. We just loved podcasts ourselves, and we just had a desire to try to bridge the knowledge gap out there between well-resourced and less resourced families by providing knowledge. And we recorded an episode, and we didn't even know what we were doing, so we never even went with it, actually, the first one. And we said, you know what, we better figure out what the heck we're doing. So we hired Evo Terra, who's actually one of the most knowledgeable podcast experts in the country. And we were under his tutelage for 3 or 4 months. And then we listened to 100 different podcasts, trying to figure out what we liked, what we didn't like when we were like building our format out. But it was just a concept back then. Now we know every single time we have an episode, we're going to hear every day from listeners. And so that's why it's kind of more exhilarating now, because any one of us in education, and this is all of our 7 co-hosts, we do this to make a difference in the lives of people. None of us has taken 1 red cent ever for doing this. We pay our staff, but not our co-hosts. But we know we're making a difference. And, you know, just last night, I read a really powerful letter that came in from a listener in Nicaragua about how our podcast is helping. And so that's why exhilaration's my word of the day. And I'm dedicating this episode to you, our listeners. Somebody once said, if you ever see a turtle on a fence post, one thing you know, the turtle didn't get there alone. And so it's you and mostly our listening family. That's those who never miss an episode, but all listeners who help get us here. And I particularly want to shout out anybody who's done any one of 5 things that make such a difference. The first would be talking positively about us in any Facebook group. People are really into social media, and that helps us to grow. The second is anyone who's ever written a podcast review. Last I checked, we're over 250, I think in the 270s on reviews. And so that's sort of third-party substantiation. And that can help somebody get a sense of a podcast. The next thing would be anyone who's ever sent us an encouraging note. So a listener sent in feedback just this week, and they did something really creative. They individually said what they appreciated about every one of our podcast co-hosts, and they said I could share it. And one of the podcast co-hosts didn't say that made their day. They didn't say it made their week. They said, this made my month. So that's huge, because you guys are like the fuel in our tank that keeps us going. Because if we're just out here, you know, preaching at the wind, like that gets old really, really fast. And your stats aren't enough to be the inspiration. It's just kind of knowing that you're making a difference. And then anyone who's ever made a donation, I go into yourcollegeboundkid.com and clicking that donate button. For those of you who like 2 episodes a week, coming up in June will be 2 years since we went to 2 episodes a week. You have anyone who's ever given a donation to thank for that, because we could never have expanded without the support from you. And I was just reading a review the other day, and they put it in caps. This podcast has no commercials. I love it. That's only because of those of you who have financially underwritten the cost of our podcast. So for that, we are most grateful. And then lastly, anyone's ever told anybody in your network about our podcast? That's how you grow. So episode 400 is just the start, because episode 500 will be there and episode 1000 will be there. As long as there's breath in our body, we're going to be here for you. All right, today's episode. So Susan and I are going to answer a question from Carla from Western Washington, and she wants to know a really great question. How do I know if the teacher my student is about to ask to write a rec is actually a good writer? I thought it was a fantastic question, and we're going to explore it on our segment question of the podcast. And then we're going to continue with Andy Strickler on the interview we started last week about how is reading files from a large school group different from file reading from a small school group. And some interviews, they just land well. I kind of can tell it when I'm doing it. I knew when I was doing this interview, I'm like, Andy's good and he's transparent, and our listeners are going to love it. Well, this one's really landed well. I got way more responses than I normally get in a week from part 1. And it's not uncommon for me to hear from one admission officer about a podcast in a week, but rarely am I hearing from multiple admission officers. And for whatever reason, what Andy said really landed well in the admissions community, and it was being circulated around there. I heard from quite a few admission officers this week about how much they appreciated what he had to say. So we'll continue of part 2 of 3 with Andy Strickler. And friends, if you live anywhere close to the Durham, Raleigh area, we would love to meet you. And I say we, Lisa, Linda, Susan, and I, we will all be in Durham on March 23rd from 7 to 8:30 to meet our listeners. We're going to have fun. We're going to mingle. We're going to play games like podcast trivia and college trivia. We're going to give prizes away. And my oldest daughter, who appeared on a national cook show for a cooking competition, she's going to be making some delicious food for us. So we'd love to have you join us. But you do need to sign up. And we have 22 spots left. So if you go to yourcollegeboundkid.com and you will see a tab that says events, click events, and you'll see the Durham YCBK gathering. Just click it and confirm your spot while we have the 22 seats remaining. And by the way, just to show how awesome our listeners are, we get a good response to this, then we'll do it again when we're in Los Angeles at the National Admission Conference, NACAC, and maybe a month or so. I just teased it out there. I said, we don't have the resources to do hosting, but if one of our listeners in the greater LA area wants to host, let us know. And 2 people have already responded saying, I'd love to host that event. So that's just how awesome our YCBK listeners are. Go ahead and sign up at yourcollegeboundkid.com, events/Durham YCBK gathering. But before we get to that, let's dive in with my question from a listener with Susan.
And now it's time for a question from one of our listeners.
All right, friends, I'm here with Susan, and we have a fantastic question. How are you, Susan?
I'm great, Mark. Thanks. How are you?
Good. I'm excited to talk to you about this question. It's from Carla from Western Washington. We'll play it, and I'll get Susan's thoughts, and then I'll chime in.
Hi, this is Carla from Western Washington. I was just wondering, how do you determine if a teacher is a good fit for a letter of recommendation writing experience? Say your kid has a great relationship with a teacher who taken multiple classes with them, and they potentially oversee their extracurricular activity, but you're not sure how great they are at actually writing a strong letter of recommendation. How do you tactfully determine this? Thank you so much. Bye.
So, Carla, you ask a good question here, and I'm not sure there's an easy answer for it. This is, above all, a very human business. And all of us have faced this also when we've looked for job recommendations and other kinds of things, and that they're, asking for a letter of recommendation is fundamentally an act of faith. And you have to make that good choice based on the best information that you have. And if you can gather a little intel about the strength of the person's ability to craft a recommendation. But, what makes for a good recommendation is the relationship between the student and the teacher. And the teacher does not have to be a Pulitzer Prize winning author. I only very occasionally read a letter of recommendation that is like publication worthy. It's so beautifully crafted. But most of them are written off the cuff. They often follow a fairly standard format. But the quality of the information and the sincerity of the description of the student and the student's performance and effect on other kids in the classroom and the potential to be successful is really trumps everything. And that doesn't have to be exquisite. Now, if you have some grounds for worrying about this, then that's a whole nother issue. But perhaps you could speak with the guidance counselor or the college counselor, or actually have your child do that, of course. And just to say, here's who I'm going to be asking, and I think the content would be great. Do you ever get any feedback? As a college counselor, I had a few teachers at my school about whom I had qualms, but none of them were a disaster. I just felt that sometimes teachers, it was more about content. So I just did workshops with the faculty every year and kept teaching them how to do great recommendations. But I basically felt that if they were a teacher at a good school, they were good writers. They had liberal arts educations. Even some who were not native speaking, they were from other countries or spoke other languages as their first language. They knew how to do it. They were well prepared. Often, if a teacher was insecure about their writing ability, and I had, and Mark, you can probably imagine who they were at our school where we both were.
I have some people in mind who won't be mentioned.
They often had a colleague read the letter. And often in an academic department, they would have meetings where they read each other's letters and gave each other feedback and pooled information, which was wonderful. I don't think there are a lot of schools where teachers have time necessarily to do that. But I would say maybe have your child check it out with their counselor and just say, I don't want to be nervous about this because I really respect this teacher. I think also any help that your child can provide to the teacher in terms of not a brag sheet. I think you've heard me speak before on how much I dislike that concept, because way too many teacher recommendations paraphrase the student's resume, and they really lose value as a teacher letter in that regard. What you want is for them to talk about their direct observations and their direct experience. Now, they might have been the robotics coach and also taught the student physics. That's awesome. Or an English teacher who also directed a play. But to just simply quote the resume is a real waste of space on the page, because when we read applications, we're looking for, frank, direct experience, and nothing beats that.
So a number of things you said in there that are important, Susan. One is it's about the relationship the student has. And it was clear from Carla's question that her student does have a good relationship. Another thing you said was your default should be to trust that they're good. That should be the
Absolutely.
default position. The school's hired them. I have a couple follow-ups for you. One, any suggested phraseology if you are talking to a counselor to ask the question in a way that doesn't put the counselor in a position where they feel like they're throwing somebody under the bus, potentially? Like, any suggested language of how it can be worded to give the counselor an out if the counselor has reason to want to direct somebody to direct you in a different direction, but doesn't want somebody coming back and saying, hey, I was like, I apparently you're telling people not to have me do letters of recommendation.
Right.
Can we talk? I'm uncomfortable with this.
Right. That would be bad.
Any thoughts on that? And then the other thing is, I would like you to go into a little more depth on how, as a reader, you can tell when somebody knows the person and when the relationship has depth and substance versus when it's superficial. And anything you want to say on that, on either of those topics?
Well, I think in terms of the student asking the college counselor or the guidance counselor, at some point there should be a discussion there just to say, here's who I'm thinking of asking. What do you feel about that balance? I had this discussion with every junior in the spring as we had this, and I would say, who are you thinking about? Who really knows you? I would talk with the junior about what they were thinking of leading with as their academic interest. So I could reflect on the information a reader might gain from the recommendation that would be relevant to the student's potential to be successful in that subject area on the college level. And I always encouraged our teachers to write about that, to step back maybe at the end of their letter and say, thinking ahead to, Mark potentially as a physics major in a college classroom, and try and envision what Mark would be like in that physics classroom based on the high school experience. And that can be very powerful in a letter. But, that's a little off the mark here. But if the student says to the counselor, I like this balance, do you have any concerns about the quality of the letters?
I have had some students ask me a question similar to this before.
Really?
And yeah, and what I've encouraged them to do was go to the counselor, like you said, and have a couple people in mind and say, I'm kind of torn. On one hand, I could have Miss Jackson, my history teacher, but I could also have Mr. Roberts, my physics teacher. Like, what do you think? And because what it does is it can allow the counselor to say, oh, I think, the history teacher might be a good one for you. And without throwing somebody under the bus or even implying the other buddy, I have concerns, And so that's kind of the approach that I have used. And I've gotten good feedback on it because it does give the counselor the ability to direct you a little bit without saying anything negative about the other one if they have concerns. If they don't have concerns at all, then they'll say either one would be fine. What do you think? It's, the other thing, and I learned this first from some admission officer, I can't remember who it was, but it really stuck with me. It was a presentation on recommendations. And they said, normally a good verbal communicator is a good written communicator.
Absolutely.
So ask yourself, are they a good teacher as far as, I know you have a good relationship with them, but you're telling me you're concerned about their ability to put pen to paper. Well, how effective are they verbally communicating? I'm sure there's exceptions, but most of the time the skills go together, and so that's a little bit of advice, But,
I really do believe that the student in his or her heart would kind of knows what a teacher is going to say, right? That's why they're picking them, right? They kind of know the emotional and intellectual experience with that teacher, whether it's been just a semester or maybe 3 years of school. Maybe it's been clubs outside. Maybe it's just been the classroom. They're picking that teacher for a reason because they are anticipating what it is they have observed and can report on. I think then it is important for the student to have a conversation with the teacher about that and just say, I really want to let you know why I'm asking you, because I'm very honored to have you represent me. And here was my biggest learning experience in your class. Here was my biggest aha moment. Here's what convinced me that I might like to study, ancient history in college. Give them a little to go on. So even
I like that a lot, Susan.
because
I
then
like that
even
a
a
lot.
less secure teacher, teacher recommendations should only be, a couple paragraphs a page.
Sure.
Really.
The other thing is I feel like that also gives you a read too. Like
Yes.
how does that conversation go? Do you sense a level of enthusiasm? Because I've always said, I'm just drawing back on myself when I used to get asked to do rec letters a lot. There was a student who would approach me and I would feel honored that they asked me. It was literally a compliment. And I was
Yes.
enthusiastic and happy to write on their behalf. And that's the reaction that I'd like to see students get. If you sense any reticence, there's another student that I needed to say, I think there's somebody who can probably, I would usually say who knows you better than I do, was typically what I would say. I really do. I really think there's someone who knows you better that will be able to do you more justice. But I think you can tell by how that conversation goes and whether it's warmly greeted or whether somebody makes you feel like you're throwing another task on their list and they're reluctant. That's telling as well, because
I agree.
Yeah, because that, that enthusiasm. Well, we just had Andy Strickler on recently, and he made this point very clearly. He's, even though you absolutely can tell when a teacher is enthusiastic about a student when you read those letters. I loved the way he almost used a staccato type delivery to emphasize that.
Although you can have enthusiasm with no evidence.
Yep. Yeah.
And a recommendation has to have evidence.
Yeah.
You can get a lot of warm and fuzzies.
Yeah.
And you can get a lot of vague statements like, Mark makes the classroom a better place for everybody.
Sure.
And,
No specifics.
What is that? What does that mean?
Right.
And then a short example brings that to life. It cements it. A lot of teachers use euphemisms that could actually have double meanings. And yet those recommendations you basically end up ignoring because you can't decide what the teacher means. The teacher has to be completely clear about what they mean. There can't be any innuendo. I don't think there is on purpose. I think sometimes a teacher may be insecure and just is adding fluff to their letter, and it can come across as, you just end up disregarding it. That's why I think the conversation with the student is so critical.
And Susan, I tell all of my students to, in those conversations, ask the teacher if they would be willing to share examples. Ask them, because I really think it's the same thing that we say in all writing: show, don't tell.
Right.
And I always use the example with my students of Becky Sapke and her letter from the janitor. I said, if the janitor would have said kind, thoughtful, caring, considerate, compassionate, it's a string of positive adjectives that most people say because most people are going to be positive and most people are going to pick somebody presumably that's going to say nice things. But it was the anecdotes that made that so powerful. It's when people leave a mess, he stays behind with us and cleans the tables. He walks around with us and turns off all the lights.
That's right.
He knows every one of our members of the staff by name. It was all of that stuff that totally makes it come alive. And so and when I when I attend workshops, and I used to attend a lot of them at KIPP, because they would come in, these schools would come in and do these writer workshops because they see such a difference between the excellent letters that more well-resourced, especially independent schools get versus a lot of other schools, and they don't want kids to be at a disadvantage. They would all emphasize that. Give us give us story, give us anecdote. It's just don't give us a string of adjectives. And they'd also say, don't spend so much time talking about yourself either. Some people go on and on and on about their credentials and how they've sent, so many kids for 30 years to the
Oh my
school.
gosh, I
And they
know.
mean
It's like,
well. They mean well. I'm sure you see that sometimes on the
I know, but
Well, do
it's
you get
so
some of that?
braggadocious. A
It's
little bit
about the
is nice.
kid.
I think it's
Right.
helpful, when a teacher says, I've been a US history teacher
Mhm.
for 20 years, and even tells a little bit about the curriculum, where you get some actual insight into a student's the development of fundamental critical thinking, reading and writing skills. When a teacher talks about how they performed on, for example, a DBQ in US history, or a major scientific methodology research paper, where you can get some real content about the level at which I also love it when teachers talk about when learning isn't easy for the student, because it shouldn't always be easy. If it is easy, the teacher actually is probably not tough enough.
Mhm.
But where a student hits the wall in a class and has to up his or her game, and how the teacher sees that happening, which I like.
That's something I feel is really underrated, and most students don't understand how valuable that can be. And the reason why I know that is one of the first things that students start talking about when I start talking about recommendations is where they got their highest grade. They
Right.
go right to that.
Sure.
And they don't necessarily know that you're not looking for somebody to just say, "Oh, this came really, really easy to this person," and I never saw them stretched.
That's
They,
right.
they they tend to think that makes for a great recommendation. Wow, that I'm going to look really smart.
That's
Um,
right. No, I
yeah.
completely agree. The other thing that a teacher has to be clear on is confidential information that they may be privy to, but should never, ever, ever disclose without permission of the family. Counselors understand that because it's part of their training of how to handle diagnostic information. But this was a mistake teachers at our school made, and occasionally I caught and realized that for some reason they thought it was okay, but I had to be clearer with them about what the guidelines were.
Do you see a lot of that now, Susan? Of course, you don't know what conversations people may have had, but do you see things where you wince and you're like, "Gee,
I sure do. I sure do. Where I'm horrified that the first and only mention of diagnostic information comes from a teacher. Now, you know what? It's the presence of diagnostic information is not a bad thing. It's not a negative. And I would never want our listeners to think that it was. But somewhere along the line, the student is making a decision, perhaps with his family, perhaps with his counselor, about how much they want to disclose.
Mhm.
And that's their prerogative, right? I'm a big fan of disclosure because
Sure."
it provides context for understanding often the student's resilience and strengths, right? But when you kind of suddenly read a teacher recommendation and get slammed with some, I read one today, in fact, where the student had been institutionalized for a period of time during the junior year, and it was absolutely nowhere else in the. Now, my first thought is that the teacher's wrong and has the student mixed up with someone else. And so my driver and I just kind of chuckled and said, well, we're ignoring that, and it's a total non-issue. You're a professional, you know how to move on. But sometimes you're left saying, is the teacher thinking of the wrong student, or are they just not using good sense in what they're sharing? If those questions ever come up when reading a teacher recommendation, the recommendation is just discounted. You only use information that you know is valid. Otherwise, it becomes a guessing game or a crystal ball, and that serves no one.
Well, Carla, thank you so much for sending in this question.
Yeah,
And hopefully we gave you a few pointers to help your student. And please send us more questions in.
that's right. Thank you, Carla.
And now this week's interview with a special guest.
Friends, if you missed the first part of my interview with Andy Strickler, we strongly recommend you go back and listen to what I thought was one of the more memorable interview segments we've had. But in part 2 of 3, Andy busts the myth that there's a firm quota on the number of kids from each school. And he talks about how demonstrated interest impacts admissions decisions, and he explains how nuanced this is. And he talks about how counselor calls come into play in these busy school groups. And he talks about demonstrated disinterest. And he talks about how being well-resourced impacts decisions. And finally, Andy talks about institutional pressures. Listen and enjoy.
If you think about the most precious commodity that a place like Yale or Harvard or Princeton or Brown has, it's an offer of admission. And how do we allocate this very finite resource? And how do we prevent ourselves from over-allocating an outsized share of admits to one particular school or one particular geographic region? And therefore, I think on both sides, coming from an extraordinarily large school group can potentially work against you.
And I really appreciate your transparency on this, Andy. It's something that really can be shocking to people.
Yeah.
Because they've gotten into these schools, and part of what might have allured them was that they thought the college list looked impressive. In fact, to be honest, one of the tools that admissions officers use to recruit students to their private high school is the college list, the list of where students eventually go to college. They present the college list in a way that helps them to allure students. How do I know this? Because guilty as charged. It's one thing that I did when I was an associate director of admissions at the Westtown School. I took our college list, and I knew we wouldn't have as many colleges on our list as the biggest brand names that some of our competitors had. Some of those schools were larger than us, in some cases double or even triple, and they're also more selective. And I'm talking about schools that Andy is the territory manager now. Schools like Choate Rosemary Hall in Connecticut, Phillips Exeter in New Hampshire, St. Paul School in New Hampshire. I knew families wanted to see those impressive brand name colleges when they were looking at, if they made this kind of investment, where were kids getting admitted and ending up? So I approached my boss, the director of admissions, with an idea. I said, why don't we take all the schools we have had multiple kids attend in the last 5 years, and instead of saying 3 kids went here, 1 kid went here, 6 kids went here, let's put it in bold instead of listing the actual numbers of enrollees. Of course, this was marketing. I knew people wanted to see the Browns and the Penns and the Yales and the Princetons and the Dukes and the Northwesterns and the Stanfords. I knew that, and it was very intentional on my part. I knew they would appear in bold, and this is what families wanted to see. And I knew almost all those names, we had multiple kids who were accepted, in many cases enrolled. So admission officers are part of the problem at creating this unrealistic expectations. I know I certainly was. When I look back at it, you could really make a case that it was false advertising. I've also come to hear the horror stories over the years from the college counselors who often, legitimately and understandably, in my opinion, are always pushing back at the admission office at these private high schools and saying, stop presenting the college list to families in a way that's inflating their expectations. This is often what college counselors either say directly or are thinking about the admission office at these private day and boarding schools and how they present their college list. I'll tell you the kinds of thoughts that either college counselors think or even say in conversations with admission officers. Are you telling them that the kids that get in were usually, at these most selective schools, usually were either recruited athletes, donors' kids, faculty's kids, celebrities' kids, high-level artistic talent, or some unique compositional diversity that's very hard for the schools to find and get? And that it doesn't apply to them? Of course you aren't. But they don't know that, and it's creating unrealistic expectations for us, and then therefore they're getting upset when their kids don't they thought they would get in when they paid the money to attend the school. As I'm sharing this with you, and maybe this is my confessional hour, but what I was doing was really reprehensible, the more I think about it. I was trying to enroll the strongest kids, and that was my job. So part of it, you could argue, was defensible and understandable. But the more I think of it, I really think it crossed an ethical boundary into being misleading. It was false advertising. And I really knew better because while I was doing admissions, I was also working as an adjunct college counselor with Susan. And we used to talk about the fact that if you look at the 10 to 15 kids that got into the most selective schools, how many of them met a unique institutional priority? How many of them had a hook that was hard for the colleges to get? And I can tell you, it was the overwhelming majority of them. One of the classic books on the college essay is a book I sometimes recommend to my students, written by Henry Bald, and it's entitled On Writing the College Application Essay. Now, Bald was a former admission officer at both Brown and Columbia. And in the book, Bald says, you can divide all of applicants into two groups. Those who have a built-in lobby within the admission office. In other words, they have a hook. They have somebody internally who will lobby for them. And those who, now I'm going to use his term, are just folks. Many students in the most competitive school groups are, to use Henry Bald's term, just folks. But they're looking at the college results from kids who have a built-in lobby in the admission process. And these families who are just folks are impressed with the college list they see at these elite schools. But the reason those kids were admitted are because they meet a unique institutional need of the school, and that does not apply to them. And admission officers at these private schools are partly to blame for this widespread understanding. I know that I was. But there's so many things that they're not taking into consideration, right? Legacy, development, athletics.
Yeah, the hooks that exist that make a Navion scattergram have an extraneous data point that makes no sense.
Correct. Exactly. You know, I send a fair amount of kids to boarding school. I used to do a whole lot more. I've had more than one occasion where I had a middle school valedictorian not get into places like Exeter and Milton. So there's just how selective they are on the front end.
Right.
And then a lot of schools still don't want to see a bunch of C's.
Yeah.
If you're in the bottom, whatever, quartile of that applicant pool.
Right. Absolutely. 100%.
And I think this is an important conversation because there's a lot of entitlement that comes with going to those schools when it comes to college. In my opinion, right?
Absolutely.
Part of it is the money I've paid. Now I expect to have advantages I didn't have. I mean, I've had many a person say that to me, like, I did not pay X amount of money to have a similar option that I would have had if I would have gone to my public school.
Yep.
And I would argue the misreading of the college list when they look at the college list, because they don't understand institutional priorities and hooks and all the different ways in which the people that are admitted are meeting this institution's needs.
Just and think about the motivation that led to Varsity Blues.
Sure.
You know, I've paid X amount of money. What's $50,000 to $100,000 more to help make sure I get the result / the credential that I feel I deserve?
Now, here's the other side of this coin, and this is why sometimes this is tricky for me to communicate. I'm trying to tap into you. There's also this perception that I encounter in counseling that there's only one spot, you know? Oh, so-and-so from my school, I didn't know they're a recruited athlete. I'm damned. Like, no. There's not a quota of one either. No. You'll be willing to take multiple kids if they're meeting your needs and they're strong. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's a balance. You know, I once sat on a panel at a Mid-Atlantic independent school, and the director of admission at a highly selective university said, well, you know, if we see 7 great applicants from this school, we'll take all 7. And I'm like, I don't know if that's true.
Sure.
But the opposite of that, we can only take 1, not true at all. Not true at all. You know, this idea that they're quotas and we're only going to take 1 student from this place and we already have our 1, which is a recruited athlete. And I think about it this way, and this is where my history as a former athlete and coach and my bias towards athletics sort of influences my thinking. And I talk about it when I talk about our coaches in our athletic teams. We're inherently selfish people. Our coaches want the best athletes, whether they're recruited and they arrive in early Decision I, or they just are some random student who shows up in regular decision. If the student athlete is good enough to help us win, the coach is going to be like, yeah. And the same thing applies to admissions. We want the best class and we want the best communities we can get. And if it means taking 2 or 3 students from school X, Y, or Z, if that's going to help us accomplish our goal, we inherently are selfish. I don't know if it's selfish.
Yeah, I wouldn't call it selfish.
Yeah, but
I would say it's my role, it's my job, to make my institution as strong as possible.
Exactly.
And that's my job.
Yeah, and that doesn't mean one here, one here, one here. Well, we already have our one, so we're going to read the other 38 and just say wait list. That works against our institutional interest. And it works against my personal interest as someone who spends as much time wandering around a college campus as I do.
I want to come back to something you said. I want to start with a compliment. Several people I know have attended College presentations and have come away quite impressed with your level of transparency about how you talk about demonstrated interest.
Yeah.
You guys talk about it in a way that other people don't. Other people act, I don't want to say the broad across the board, but you know what you hear out there. Oh, we don't look at demonstrated interest. You hear that all the time.
Right.
I have frequently quoted Jim Bach, who
love Jim Bach. Hey,
and
his first job was here at Connecticut College.
I didn't know that.
Yes, and his wife is a Connecticut College graduate.
Wow, I didn't know that.
He's the man. I love Jim.
Well, Jim's great on this. I was attending a presentation and someone came at him like in a real sort of a negative tone. They're like, "Don't tell me you're one of these schools that looks at demonstrated interest, are you?" And he said, "We have ED1 and ED2. Of course we'd look at demonstrated interest.
Yeah, exactly.
What do you think early decision is?"
Yeah.
But that's not the way it's so oftentimes described. You know how people sort of act like they're above that. But right. I appreciate the real talk that you give. So now I want to bring it back to this context. What about if you're working with a busy school group and you have a lot of data to indicate that a lot of people from a school tend to treat us as a backup and they don't tend to come? We have a low yield rate from this school.
Correct.
Is it appropriate to factor that in? I know you'd go case by case. I know you wouldn't just say carte blanche across the board, we're going to waitlist you because we haven't had a good track record from this school. But is it fair to say, I want to see a little more from people from this school because in regular admission, we're getting like less than 1 in 10 or whatever number it is that you feel is not a good yield. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, this is a very nuanced sort of gray area for me.
I know.
I was reading a week ago here in my office with one of our readers. And on multiple times during the day, we're reading committee-based evaluations. So It's me and another reader. We're paired, we're reading the file. We get to the end, we discuss. And at the end, on multiple times during the day, I said something to the effect, highly unlikely to attend.
Right.
But they've earned the right to get extended an offer of admission from Connecticut College. So there are numerous instances where that's where I land.
Sure.
Where the data, the analytics say really unlikely, but how do we say no to this?
Mm-hmm.
There have been numerous occasions over the course of my career where students have ended up on our wait list because we got the sense that they just weren't that interested. Now, the one piece that I would say is one piece of my school group that you forgot to mention earlier is I've picked up the state of Pennsylvania this year.
Yeah, I saw that on there as well.
So,
do you have the whole state? Because it said Pennsylvania.
Yep, I got the whole state.
Okay.
I mean, as much as we don't want to acknowledge Pittsburgh if we're from Philly, yes, the whole state.
Well, I know how many schools you have just in Metro Philly. That's a lot.
Exactly.
Man. So,
and I would say that we're reading Pennsylvania last week, and I'm like, great, unbelievable student, super amazing young person from Pennsylvania. The analytics say probably not likely, but they've earned the right to get an offer of admission from Con. Okay. That is totally different from than a student from East Lyme, which is literally 15 minutes down the road here, who could present the exact same profile and the exact same characteristics. And that's a case where demonstrated interest might really play a factor because we're 15 minutes up the road.
Sure.
I mean, the number of times that student has literally driven right by my campus while driving to Stonington or Mystic or Westerly or, the Cape or wherever they're going, they've had a million opportunities to come visit. And in that case, we're going to have a serious conversation about demonstrated interest and whether this student needs to end up on the wait list. Now, when it comes to large school groups who we have a poor track record from case-by-case basis, there are plenty of times where we can look at this profile and say that, the analytics say there's less than a 1% chance for this student to enroll at Con. And frankly, the cases where I have moved a student from admit to wait list, I have had a conversation with the school counselor and said, this is what we're thinking about doing because we've gotten the sense that they're going to read very well at other places and they're not that interested in us. Tell me I'm wrong. And most every time I've had that conversation, the college counselor's been like, yeah, you're right on. Don't worry about it. Student's going to have multiple options, no big deal. So case by case, there's a lot of nuance and a lot of gray area here. Geography plays into it. Socioeconomics plays into it.
And explain how they play into it. I mean, you partly explain the geography. If someone's around the corner and they can't have engagement versus if they're coming from Hawaii or Idaho or El Paso, Texas or something.
Yeah.
It's part of geography, right? So
for a student from East Lyme, Connecticut College in New London, Connecticut is literally 15 minutes up I-95. For a student from Boise, Idaho or, Seattle, Washington or, Chico, California, it takes a lot of effort to get here. And therefore, a totally different standard on demonstrated interest is going to be applied to that student. And socioeconomics are also going to play a role.
Could you afford to do certain things versus not afford, or is it more nuanced than that?
It's way more nuanced than that. The reality is that, you've seen the New York Times and all the research that's been done connecting socioeconomics with likelihood to be admitted to highly selective institutions. And whether that's directly the byproduct of socioeconomics or it's the secondary product of socioeconomic creating opportunity.
It's definitely a lot of that.
Absolutely.
I'll tell you something you'll find interesting. So the reason that I started that college fair that you came to at Kalamazoo, I was working with Susan. I was helping her. There was one student who had already taken her third trip to California by the start of the 11th grade. There was another student from Chester, and Philly, so you know exactly where Chester is.
Yep, I know Chester.
And this student, parents didn't have a car. They couldn't get to Princeton 69 miles away.
Yeah.
And that's when I said, something's wrong here. You're on your third trip to California. You can't get 60 miles from Chester to Princeton or 69 miles from our school in Westchester, Pennsylvania to Princeton. So I said, hey, Susan, why don't we create a fair where we'll bring the colleges to the students and then you guys all, comply. But that's that thing you're talking about.
Absolutely. Socioeconomics influences college decisions directly through socioeconomics. Even some need-blind schools make decisions that don't come across as need-blind. And the number of truly need-blind institutions in the United States continues to shrink. So socioeconomics affects things in a direct fashion, but it also influences things in an indirect fashion in terms of creating or presenting opportunities for a particular young person. And as a result, socioeconomics and those two sort of parallel influences are absolutely going to influence demonstrate an interest in decisions that we make.
Well, let's talk. What are the ways socioeconomics impact demonstrated interest beyond just you had the money to visit? Because they're, like you said, that's only part of it. Talk about some of the other ways besides that.
Think about I got to be careful about my use of terminology here, but I would say, think about high school athletics.
Sure.
I'm 52 years old. I graduated from high school in 1989. High school athletics, when I was in high school, was high school athletics. And the reality is that club soccer in the Philly area had really kind of started to become a thing.
Mm-hmm.
But you think about what adolescent athletics has become in terms of the socioeconomic expectations and burden on a family. When was it? It was before Christmas. I met with a young lady on campus who's a basketball player and is interested in playing college basketball, was here to see us play Mount Holyoke. And we were standing in the gym chit-chatting. And I was like, how many weeks a year do you spend at a tournament playing basketball? And, outside of the high school season, she's got about 2 weeks off. Think about the socioeconomic burden that puts on a family to have this student have the opportunity to play basketball. So there are just so many different ways in which socioeconomics can lead to, enhanced opportunity, which leads to greater chances of success or greater chances of admission at a highly selective place, And that's part of the issue with athletic recruitment is that, we've had these conversations in the NESCAC about athletic recruitment and how do we make sure that our efforts in recruiting student athletes to our particular campuses reflect larger institutional issues around socioeconomic diversity, to make sure that we're not extending and perpetuating a system of privilege on folks who already have privilege, I guess is the way I'd put it.
Sure. I want to go back, Andy, and I appreciate your thoughts there, by the way. It's an area close to my heart. I want to go back to sort of the whole conversation, how sometimes when you don't think they're going to come, you'll say you just have to offer, and then other times you don't, right? There's a lot of nuance there. Do you think it's fair to say that certain admission directors are under more pressure than others to keep that admit rate down? And if you're under pressure to keep that admit rate down, then you might just waitlist those kids and make them prove to you that they really want to come.
Absolutely. 100%.
Talk about that and how that fleshes out. I mean, you know what? You have conversations with your colleagues and you know how that works.
Yeah, there are just a million different ways in which institutional pressures, in my opinion, serve to work against the best interest of young folks.
Friends, this concludes the second part of my interview with Andy Strickler. I hope you'll join us next week for part 3 as Andy addresses the topic of how decisions are made when a lot of kids apply from the same high school. On Thursday's episode, Susan and I look at 3 articles on the growth of early applications. This is actually part 2 of the segment we started last week. And a mom from Nevada asked an excellent question about how everything seems like it's changing for my 2 native students when it comes to affirmative action. Can you help us understand the new landscape? Julia will be with me to answer that question. We have a brand new interview Julia and I did with Michael Keaton on changes with the new FAFSA. And Sylvia's back. It's been a half a year or so. She'll be joined with Lisa for our brand new college spotlight. And they'll be looking at Wentworth Institute of Technology in Boston. Friends, before I leave, I can't leave without giving you a slogan. I can't leave without giving you an axiom. And today, I simply want you to remember that college is not a prize to be won. It is a match to be made. See you on Thursday, friends. And that's our show. A big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. If you find this podcast helpful, please follow us and you'll get every single episode as soon as it is released. if you're interested, there are a few ways you can really support our podcast. You can click the share button and send it to your friends and acquaintances. You can help us pay our staff and our expenses by donating on our website. You can write a review for us on Apple or Spotify. I'm the producer of the podcast, but we have a fantastic team of 15. Shout out to our co-host, Dr. Lisa Ruff, Dr. David Williams, Linda Depker, Susan Tree, Vince Garcia, and Julia Esquivel. And to our substitute co-host, Sylvia Borgo. Our sensational sound engineer is Nemanja Motvich. Our amazing music is from Victor Allen Weeks. Marketing designs are from Kimberly Blass. Lily Parikh manages our Instagram. Our image editor is Talha Khan. Joyce Ducker does our website episode updates. And our webmaster is Stalianos Dimitriou. And if you want to have a coaching session with Lisa, Linda, or me, just text me at 404-664-4340. If you have a question you want us to answer, or if you have a recommended resource or article you think we should discuss, just send it to questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com. Our favorite method is for you to record your own voice at speakpipe.com/YCBK. By the way, check out our website, where you'll find lots of content that is not on any podcast app. Our website is yourcollegeboundkid.com. If you want to learn about other hot admissions topics, follow us on Twitter at YCBK Podcasts. We think of you as our listening family, and we look forward to meeting again with you every single Monday and Thursday.